Hello everyone, my name is Trish Lynch from IOHR here in London. Thank you for being with us for another episode of our Human Rights TV. Now, the world woke up in 2014 to a horrific genocide committed by ISIS against the Yazidi community in northern Iraq, which left thousands of people killed, kidnapped and displaced. Among the atrocities were horrific stories of the Yazidi women being abused as sex slaves and hundreds of families threatened and forced to choose between conversion to Sunni Islam or death. Prominent human rights lawyers like Amal Clooney and organisations such as Yazidi have helped with the recovery effort for members of the Yazidi community that have managed to escape. With us today is Hannah Thomas, an artist and human rights activist who travelled thousands of miles to run a 2-week art rehabilitation programme in the Jinda Centre in Dahouk in northern Iraq. Her engagement with traumatised Yazidi women has helped many victims, but it's also left a mark on her, as she will share with us today. Hannah, thank you for joining us today on IOHR. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you're used to refugees. You have witnessed refugees in Jordan and Iraq. Tell me what was different about working with the Yazidi refugees.
So previously I've organised art projects for UNHCR with Syrian refugees, but those were much more large-scale projects. And the work with the Yazidi women was very much a small group of women that I was with for 2 weeks. And it was much more introspective as they were working on their own piece of work, of learning how to paint their self-portraits. And the focus of the project was to use it as a tool for advocacy, for sharing their testimonies.
Now, these people have been through horrific episodes in their lives. How difficult was it for you as an artist to paint these women who were obviously grieving?
My time with the women impacted me very, very deeply, and the paintings I painted I hoped that they conveyed something of their dignity and resilience, and also their unspeakable grief. And I hope that they would subvert something of the conventional media narratives, which very much portray the women as victims and as sex slaves. Instead, I hoped that particularly through using gold leaf, it was a way to show the restoration of dignity, but also to show their sacred value in spite of all that they've experienced in the hands of ISIS.
Tell me about the portraits that these women drew of themselves. Do you feel that you can see in their face the trauma that they've suffered?
In my paintings, I hoped that they would convey something of the women's grief, because that was a story that they wanted to share with the rest of the world. The grief for the children that they've lost and that are still in the hands of ISIS. And I think in choosing that narrative of grief enables us as viewers to relate to them much more. Whereas in the media, when we hear about sex slaves, it's very hard to empathise. But because each of us experience grief at different times in our lives and can imagine something of what it must be like for these women, this narrative enables us to feel empathy, I think, and to feel something of what these women have experienced.
Did you manage to build a relationship with them in the 2 weeks that you spent there?
Very much. We were with one another for 2 weeks, and I was teaching them to draw and then paint their self-portraits. And we also went to their holy temple, Lalish, on the day of the poignant anniversary of this ISIS taking control of Sinjar, which was a very emotional day to be able to go there with the women. And so it really felt that, and I've still got connection with them as well, and have been sending them images of where their paintings have been exhibited, so that they know that I'm still raising awareness as they will ask me to.
When you asked them to draw a self-portrait, what did you ask them to portray in that self-portrait, or did you just leave it open to their interpretation?
So we spoke at the beginning, and I was asking the women what they wanted to share with the rest of the world, and they said their grief. And then we were talking about what is it in a face that can see grief, and they were saying it's the eyes, because I was showing them some of my paintings I'd done before. They were saying it's the eyes that show the grief. So we were talking about we spent a long time drawing eyes to show that, and they wanted to also paint themselves in the white robes, the traditional dress, the Yazidi traditional dress. And so that it was very much, we were in discussion, and they were deciding amongst themselves what message they wanted to express.
So in the self-portrait, did they paint themselves differently to how you saw them?
Well, I think there's some similarities in some of the pictures. You can see aspects of their character traits shining forth. But because they'd never ever been to school or painted before, it was their very first time. So obviously they have a they have a different style that from just having learned, so it was new to them, which was, and they also were amazed at the work they were able to produce in such a short space of time, having never experienced it before as well.
Did they enjoy it?
They seemed to, very much. The concentration, the quiet in the room, as they were absorbed in the painting, was, you could almost sense it was tangible. And the women said, because I was with them at such a poignant time of grief, with the memories just flooding their thoughts, to be able to be absorbed and focused on painting was so helpful for them at that point in time.
Tell me about the Gender Centre. Tell me about the other activities that happened while you were there.
The Gender Centre, so I was there with a clinical psychologist, Dr. Sarah Whittaker-Howe, and while I was teaching the women to draw, she spent time with, and then paint, she spent time with each of the women, one-on-one, recording their testimonies, was because the aim was to share their testimonies through the medium of art and through the medium of their portrait paintings.
Do you feel this was a form of therapy for them in a way?
Although I'm not trained as an art therapist, I think there are many studies that show the process of expressive arts as being a way to express that which is unspoken, as a way in which to process something of what they've been through. And also, I think the main therapeutic aspect was a sense that they had a voice, because these pictures would go out to the rest of the world in a sense that they hadn't been forgotten.
Now, you've said in many of your interviews that you really feel that this art programme helped to restore dignity to these women. Tell me why that is.
That was very much the aim of the project, because testimony is such an important part of the recovery process post-torture and sexual abuse. The fact that these paintings are a way to share their testimonies also helps to counteract the conspiracy of silence that often prevails among communities who've experienced mass trauma, and that in itself is a way to restore dignity.
So tell me what happened. So all the women sat down, you explained that you wanted them all to do a self-portrait, gave them the tools, show them what to do, and then did it take 2 weeks to do the portrait, or did they do several?
Mostly. So we were building up the time. So it was the first day just drawing, second day drawing, and just getting used to the pencil, and then began doing a painting and practicing with a paintbrush. And so it was built up over time.
Was there any people that really stood out as having a gift, if it could be nurtured?
Very much. There was one woman who was very quiet and she didn't speak much at all, but you could see just how broken she was, just in how she was carrying herself, and was silently absorbed in the painting. And her work was exquisite, and she afterwards said she couldn't believe she produced this when she'd never painted before.
In many of your interviews, again, you've mentioned certain women who have obviously touched you. Could you tell us about some of these portraits that we have here behind us?
You can see this painting. This is Hadia, and she's my age. So Hadia is my age, just 26 years old, and she was sold to 12 different ISIS fighters. And we're the same age, but how different our lives can have been. And Basse, who's a young mother, and she was one who painted the image of ISIS separating her from her young daughter. And she's now not seen her parents or her 7 brothers in 3 years since ISIS took them from captivity. And Nazu, her parents still in captivity, and her mum, the last thing her mum said to her was, "Don't kill yourself," when she was taken away. And so all of the women have experienced unimaginable suffering at the hands of ISIS, and what they've been through is so difficult to begin to comprehend. But I think when you see their images and something of their grief, a sense of their different expressions of grief, but also there's a sense of, because they're all in the same white robes and the same gold background, there's a sense of individual but also collective grief for the community, for what their community has suffered.
Why did you decide to paint them in the white robes with the gold background?
The women actually asked me to paint them because the white robes is Yazidi traditional dress. They wanted to be painted in white because that was symbolic of their Yazidi identity. And I think a sense of identity is so important, considering the dehumanisation that they suffered at the hands of ISIS.
What was the reaction of the women when they saw their own portraits and when they saw others?
They were amazed, some of them, at what they'd been able to paint in such a short time. Then other women were angered by their picture as well, and that they hadn't been able to capture it. Like any artist, you can never fully capture what you hope to express. But when they saw So I just sent them via email the images that I'd painted for the Gender Centre to show to them, and they were very moved to see them, to see where the paintings are going as well. So, for example, the Houses of Parliament and possibly the UN and maybe the Louvre Abu Dhabi and other places like that. So their voices are being heard and their stories shared through the medium of art.
What are you hoping will happen now?
I'm hoping that the pictures will continue to be able to travel around and raise awareness, and really I hope that, because there have been some really important advocacy work being done on the part of the Yazidis through Amal Clooney and Nadia Murad, as well as the legal side. It would be it's so important that the children who are still in captivity are returned to their families, and that is what I really hoped can happen for the Yazidi community.
The human rights lawyer Amal Clooney and her Yazidi client Nadia Murad, who was gang raped and had to watch most of her family being butchered in front of her. Do you feel that having somebody of that status and that celebrity status has really shone a positive light on this?
I think Amal Clooney and Nadia Murad have done incredibly important work in raising awareness. And without their work, I think many people wouldn't have heard of the Yazidi community. And perhaps I wouldn't have heard about it, because it was through their work a few years ago that I first heard about the crisis and sought to raise funds for this project.
How can other people get involved in supporting this community through art?
I think raising awareness is very key and about the Yazidi crisis, so that they're not forgotten, because even though ISIS is no longer looming so large as a big threat in our minds and in media, the effects of their destructive terrorist behaviour has left a lasting legacy on the impact of many people, particularly the Yazidi community. And as much help needs to be done to be able to help reunite the children to their families who are still in captivity, and also to support the work of organisations such as the Gender Centre, who provide invaluable support to these women in their rehabilitation, but also in providing day-to-day necessities for survival as well.
Now, you've done an amazing thing here, but what's next for you?
I hope to be able to continue to use art as a powerful tool for advocacy and to be a voice for the voiceless, and in particular to shine a spotlight on the Rohingya crisis. And hopefully I'll be travelling there in February through an NGO BRAC, which is an art project in one of the child-friendly spaces, but also to paint some of the portraits of the women I meet. And these will be shown alongside the Yazidi women, because both groups of people are ethnic minorities who've experienced religious discrimination over many years and marginalisation, but also systematic rape, and had to flee their homes. So there are parallels in their story as well.
Do you think they will continue to paint these ladies, or do they not have the necessary raw materials to do that?
I left them the materials when I left, and so and they've continued painting some of them, and I've been sent images that they've continued working on from home, which has been really moving to see.
Hannah, we wish you well, and we'll certainly keep abreast of what you're doing next. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, thank you for watching this episode of Human Rights TV. Please join us again next time. Until then, goodbye.